Hey everyone, this is Mario again, coming at you with another movie review. Today I'm reviewing a movie I saw for the first time a couple years back. I've actually been meaning to revisit it before I reviewed it. And like Frankenstein, is considered a classic, especially among the Universal horror films. And it's one of the earliest talking horror movies, because I don't remember off the top of my head when talking movies started. I think it was mid to late 20s. Maybe early 30s, but this is one of the first horror ones that they did that was at least very popular. And it was directed by Tod Browning, who was a famous director of the silent era. He directed many films like he directed films such as the lost film London After Midnight, which had Lon Chaney in it, which is a very sought after movie. Unholy 3, Outside the Law, Bonnie Lass. Oh yeah, it looks like he also remade Outside the Law. I'm guessing that is decided to remake it in with talking, but this is probably his most well-known film of the talking era, and he didn't really direct that many talking movies because apparently he didn't like the style of it. But anyway, the movie is, of course, Dracula, starring the legendary Bela Lugosi in a role that most people know him from, Helen Chandler, David Manners, Dwight Fry, who of course followed this up with playing the hunchbacked. He's not really a hunchback. Yeah, he was a hunchback. The hunchback character Fritz in Frankenstein, and of course Edward Van Sloan, who also played a doctor in Frankenstein. And this one he plays Van Helsing. And I have to say, this is probably my second favorite incarnation of Van Helsing. My favorite one being, of course, Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of him in the Francis Ford Coppola movie. But anyway. Now, the backstory of this is that this movie is based on a stage play that was produced for a few years, which is in turn based on the novel, which of course, not only a couple movies or even attempt to actually do the story of the novel justice. Most of them just like take certain elements and create a story. The closest ones probably being the one from the early 70s called Count Dracula, which had Christopher Lee in it, which is unrelated to his Hammer films. And of course the Francis Ford Coppola one, although both takes some liberties. Now the play, it started in 1924 in London and had Raymond Huntley as the Count. Then when it moved to New York, they replaced a lot of the cast. I mean, that was where Bela Lugosi played the Count. We had Edward Van Sloan as Abraham Van Helsing as well. And of course, it eventually was translated to the screen. And some of the changes in the play were that Lucy's last name is Westera, not Westenrina. Originally, Quincy Morris was in it as a woman, but then they cut the character out completely. The play begins after one of the characters' deaths. Of course, Dr. Seward being changed to Lucy's father rather than a suitor, which is in the film as well. And he runs a mental institute in the English countryside rather than adjoining Carfax Abbey, London. And a couple other minor changes, like Renfield surviving in the play, whereas he doesn't in the movie. But it's something interesting I'd love to see. I know that there was a I gotta check to see what the word is. I know what the word. Revival, there it is. I knew it was an R word. When they revived I know that there was a revival of the play in the 70s, but I'd actually like to see them revive the play again. It was actually interesting because then when they revived the play, it had Frank Langella in the role, which they actually eventually did do a movie with him in it, which I've seen parts of it. It looks interesting. Yeah, Donald Pleasance is also in it. Interesting. Now, the movie's plot is as follows. We got Renfield, who is a solicitor, who's on his way to a castle belonging to Count Dracula in Transylvania on a business matter. The local people are very superstitious and fearful of vampires, but Renfield does not take their warnings. He eventually finds his way to the castle, which appears to be deserted, and he meets Count Dracula. And he notices there might be something weird about the man, but it's a business deal, so he's going to go through with it. It's not really stated, but you could tell he probably thinks that the Count might be eccentric. Well, that night, Renfield discovers the Count is a vampire, and he eventually becomes his slave. And they board a schooner called the Vesta, which takes them to England. When they arrive, everyone on the ship except Renfield is dead, and he's now a raving lunatic who is Dracula's slave fully. Renfield is discovered and taken to an asylum. And a few nights later in a London theater, Dracula introduces himself to Dr. Seward, who is in a group in a box seat with his daughter Mina, her fiance John, and a family friend Lucy. And of course, Lucy eventually is bitten by Dracula. Hold on a sec. About that guy's important call. I'm sorry I was gone for a while. I had to check where I was, but anyway, as I was saying, Mina's bitten, and she eventually succumbs. Oh, Lucy is bitten and eventually succumbs to her wounds. And they discovered there are 2 tiny marks on her throat. At this time, they discover Renfield is obsessed with eating flies and spiders, and a friend of Seward's, Professor Van Helsing, arrives. He finds that Renfield is curious with Renfield and thinks there might be a connection somehow to that and Lucy's death. And at this time, Dracula is also visiting Mina. Van Helsing meets Dracula and accidentally discovers Dracula's secret, that he does not have a reflection in a mirror. And from there, it slowly goes into the fact that now Van Helsing and Dracula basically are becoming adversaries. And now they have to find a way to save Mina before Dracula can make her the undead. And of course, there's also the little subplot that's never really shown a lot of, where Lucy is stalking children, which is in the novel too. Now, the production history of this movie is interesting. Before this, Dracula had already been filmed once without permission as Nosferatu by German expressionist filmmaker F.W. Murnau, which was... It's been a while since I've seen Nosferatu, but it is a pretty good silent film, and I could see why it was very influential with horror, at least with vampires during its time, and I could see how it would scare people. And of course, Stoker's widow sued for plagiarism and copyright infringement, and basically all prints of Nosferatu were ordered to be destroyed, but luckily that wasn't the case. Anyway, young Hollywood producer Carl Laemmle, I think it's Laemmle, L-A-E-M-M-L-E, Jr. Anyway, he saw the box office potential of the novel, and he legally acquired the rights, and he wanted Dracula to be a film on the scale of The Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1923 and the famous Phantom of the Opera from 1925. And like those films, they wanted Lon Chaney to star in it, despite the fact Chaney was under contract at MGM. Tod Browning was approached to direct it, and of course, like I mentioned, by this point he'd already directed Chaney in London After Midnight. And of course, before they could get it with Chaney succumbed to throat cancer that he'd been diagnosed with, which, as a lot of people have pointed out, it's kind of ironic that Chaney dies from, it's throat cancer. He dies from throat cancer with the Birth to Sound films. Kind of ironic. Even though he had done a couple sound movies, though. Anyway, because of this, and with the Great Depression, they couldn't do a film on the grand scale, so they decided to cut back on it, which is why the film is not that elaborate, but still is kind of atmospheric. And also because of this, they decided to go with Lugosi, apparently, because he had played the character on stage, so they decided to go with him. And of course, there's a rumor that Lugosi's speech patterns as Dracula was because he did not speak English well and he had to speak his lines phonetically, which is kind of true because during his first roles in the late 1919, like in 1919, he had to do that, but by the time he did Dracula, he actually could speak English well, so he did it deliberately to give Dracula a kind of walking corpse thing, which kind of works, combined with the fact that there are some scenes where he doesn't even talk at all, we just see that scary stare. And of course, like Frankenstein after it, this movie also had some censorship issues. When it was reissued in 1936, an epilogue with Edward Sloane had to be deleted because they thought that they would upset some religious groups by encouraging a belief in the supernatural, because it ended with, there really are such things as vampires. It's not in the film anymore because it's presumed lost. And another one was some groans during Dracula's death scene and also some other death scene. Now, this film, I don't really know what I could say that hasn't been said with how influential this film is. Nosferatu is the first vampire film, but this is the one that basically everyone thinks of when they think of vampire films. If you were to do a list of top 5 most influential vampire films, the list would include Nosferatu, this film, probably the first of the Hammer Dracula films, or at least one of them. I don't know. I would put Coppola's film on there, but that's just me personally showing how good a vampire film can be. And probably if one other, I can't think of another one off the top of my head. But this would definitely be on there, and after revisiting the movie, I can see why. Granted, like a lot of the early films, it does kind of have some set problems, especially with this early in the Depression, so like the fake bats and stuff, I can let that slide now, and besides, I would prefer that to a CGI bat that you're like, eh. But it makes up for it with the creativity of the director, with how he shot films with the camera, how the sets are, the atmosphere, and of course the acting. One thing I will say, and this is something that I actually notice even more now since I'm actually in an acting class, it's that this is a transition period with film acting, because in the silent era, your acting was basically a physical performance that, you know, it's like over the top, like in a sound movie be considered over the top physical acting, like you have to exaggerate your movements and your reactions because your body is basically all you have. So it's a transition period that you're incorporating that. You're trying to tone down it a little bit while also incorporating vocals into it. And this is another thing that I noticed the difference is that I'm actually learning in the class, is the difference between film acting and stage acting. In stage acting, you can't really use facial expressions. You have to move your body a little bit. So your body, you have to move it not as elaborate as, say, a silent movie, but you still have to move it depending on the scene, depending how the director wants you to do it. It also depends on how you sit and stuff, stand on stage, diagonal, a bunch of stuff like that. But your voice is basically, excuse me, your voice is basically your main tool, how you inflect it. Like, for example, a scene that might seem over the top on film because of how you do your voice might actually be perfect on stage. Like an example I thought of was that scene in the 1995 Judge Dredd film where Rico and Dredd are yelling at each other, you know, "You started a massacre, blah blah blah." That is over the top on film. But on stage, depending on what type of stage you're on, etc., there's a lot of factors, but on stage, maybe not as loud as they yell in that movie, but it would be kind of perfect. Maybe not fully perfect, but it'd be more appropriate for that, which kind of makes sense considering that the actor who played Rico was a stage actor. But I know that's a little off topic for the movie, but I'm just giving that an example. The acting in this movie and some of the earlier Universal films like this, you could see that little bit of that transitional one. I noticed it more here than I did in Frankenstein. Maybe because James Whale's more of a director who can deal with talky films, whereas Tod Browning, he wasn't really like that. And I have to say, I don't really mind it. I mean, I notice a lot of stuff in the acting and how the characters move and stuff it feels like it's more meant for stage or for a different era of filming. But maybe that's the reason why Dracula doesn't have that many lines. But it doesn't really bother me. And with that, I can see why a lot of people consider the Spanish version to be superior, which I have seen the Spanish version once, and after that I saw it. But from what I remember is that the acting in the movie does seem a little bit more like it's meant for a talking movie. Granted, there are a few things I like better in this movie, like Bela Lugosi is a far better Dracula than the guy they got for the Spanish one, in my opinion. And also I liked Van Sloan's Van Helsing better, like with the scene where Dracula's attempting to hypnotize him. I thought he was a little bit more badass there, instead of being like grabbing his heart and backing away. But I don't know what else there is to say about this movie. Hasn't already been said. Classic, like I said. Anyway, my rating for Dracula, with those few minor things, I have to say probably 4.5 out of 5 stars. But if you are a fan of vampire films, even if you don't like the classic ones, I say give this a watch at least once, just so you can see the vampire film that basically, I would say, that basically started it all for in all intents and purposes.